Unreal Engine is one of many great game engines available for you to use as a developer. However, I've never once used it myself. Why is that? Well, I'm honestly not too sure. Unity was my first ever game engine, and when younger me originally downloaded it, I had never even written a script before. By the time I had figured out what game development even was, I had subconsciously decided that Unity was perfect and that changing engines now would be a complete waste of time. And I've had that opinion all the way up until now, because today I got a uni assignment to make a game in Unreal. Now, I wouldn't be making this video for any old assignment like an essay or a quiz. This particular assignment is a cool one. We need to make a boss battle. Of course, getting a fun assignment for once instantly had me excited, so I went home and for the first time ever, I installed Unreal. Now, I'll spare you all from the details, but I had no idea what I was doing. What is this? What is that? What even is a blueprint? How do I make a script? How do I add a script to a game object? Does Unreal even have game objects? It wasn't until a couple of weeks later, after a few introductory lectures, many YouTube tutorials, and many visits to various Unreal Engine forum pages, I felt that I was finally ready to actually give it a go. And this time, I had the perfect idea for my boss. A super creepy, incredibly large spider. With the boss's idea finally in mind, I instantly got to work on modelling out the spider, partly to avoid having to open up Unreal again, but mostly because I wanted to give myself a challenge to implement inverse kinematics. I figured that by giving myself a tough task to start with, I would familiarise myself with Unreal, and that way everything that would come afterwards would be a piece of cake. So now it's time to introduce you all to inverse kinematics. Inverse kinematics, otherwise known as IK, is an animation technique often used to create realistic looking movement in games. If you've ever played a game where the character's feet line up with the floor, then that was IK. The same goes for any VR games where you have arms that bend as you move your controllers, or, and this next one is quite important for my project, for procedurally animated creatures. And you guessed it, this spider is going to be procedurally animated. Now, I can't go into all the details of how IK works, not because we don't have the time, but I just simply don't have enough knowledge to feel confident in explaining it. However, I can give you a basic example. If you look over at this arm generously provided by Miles on Sketchfab, you will see that it is made up of bones, which are used to control the position of the mesh. If I select part of this hand and move it around, you can see that the mesh deforms, and now the arm looks a little bit broken. Now let's try that again, but this time with IK enabled. If I go to move this arm now, you can see that the entire rest of the arm follows behind, exactly how you'd expect it to work in real life. Pretty simple, right? Well, unfortunately not, since this example was made in Blender, so now it's time to try and figure it out in Unreal. It took me 5 long days of work to get to this point. However, after many failed blueprints, reworking the spider's bones maybe 30 odd times, and every tutorial I could find on the surface of the internet, I can proudly present to you the spider walking. And no, it doesn't move on its own yet, I'm literally just pulling it around the scene. So while I'm working on the movement, I figure there's no better time to explain to you how I want this game to work. In this game, I want the spider to constantly circle around the player like it's hunting prey, which will work perfectly for the game loop that I want to create. I want the game to play quite like fighting a ghast in Minecraft, only the ghast can't fly, is replaced with a huge spider, shoots webs instead of fireballs, and the blocky environment will be replaced with a cave and Steve by a default capsule. But otherwise, exactly like a ghast fight. And while I was explaining all of this, it looks like Past Me has finished creating the movement code. So let's check it out, shall we? Okay, well that's looking pretty good, but I'm sure there's something we can do to make it look a bit better. Perhaps adding a few visuals. Thankfully, graphics is Unreal Engine's middle name, and one of the major selling points of the engine. So simply adding some fog took the scene from looking fine-ish to very visually interesting. Alright, well we've got the movement, but just using this flat terrain defeats the whole purpose of spending 5 days on the inverse kinematics. So let's get an environment going to really seal the deal. So now we have the basis of an environment that I will admit is lacking some detail, but that's something to worry about later. More importantly, we need to go back to the boss fight. We still need to add the ability for the spider to attack, the ability for the player to return those attacks, and then to add a health bar to both. All things that sound pretty simple on paper, right? Well, unfortunately, that was not the case. So I did what I always do when the going gets tough. I made a quick prayer to the programming gods and stayed up until 3 in the morning, hunched over my screen, bathing in all the good blue light. And for the sacrifice of my sleep, the Lords above blessed me with knowledge no human could comprehend, which led to this. Now I don't know about you, but that's looking pretty perfect to me. It wasn't long after that I finally managed to get something that slightly represented a projectile coming from the spider. Of course, moments after setting this up, I discovered that Unreal literally has a projectile movement component built into the engine that I could have been using the whole time. So after a few changes to the code, now the spider can shoot these projectiles. Then I got to work on adding the ability for the player to return those projectiles. To do this, we shoot a trace sphere from the camera. If the projectile is within this sphere cast, then we can take the camera's forward direction and apply a force to the projectile in that direction. This means the player can hit the projectile while not directly facing it, allowing the player to sort of guide the projectile in the direction they're looking at. I got it to a point that it just about worked, and then got ready to add the health system. UI in Unreal is very different to UI in Unity. Instead of creating a canvas in the hierarchy, you create a widget blueprint. These can contain functions of their own, and Unreal provides you with way more options out of the box to create UI. If I was giving points to each engine, I would say Unreal definitely takes this one, although actually getting the UI to show up on the screen seemed unnecessarily complicated, so I'm confident that I was doing it wrong. Ignoring that, the UI is finished, and the game finally has something that slightly resembles a gameplay loop. The spider can shoot, the player can fight back, and both can take damage, which means now it's time to slightly adjust every single value in the game until everything feels just right. Firstly, since I was on a roll with UI, I added a pause screen along with a win and lose screen. I then made some adjustments to the projectile, replacing the old spherical model with a spider's web, making it shoot at random intervals instead of every 3 seconds, and finally made it arc through the air instead of being shot directly at the player. These were all of the nice and simple changes that I could quickly make by just adjusting the pre-existing code. Moving into some new features, I added a few changes to the spider. To start with, I made it so the spider will level up depending on how much damage it takes. These level ups will make the spider move faster, shoot faster projectiles, and shoot more often. I've also been playing a lot of Elden Ring recently, so it wouldn't be a boss fight without the ability to stagger the spider, so I added that too. And now I can happily present to you the finished boss fight.